2 days after David Cameron's long-awaited speech, The Economist branded him the gambler. Indeed, the Prime Minister is playing a three-level game on Britain's relationship with Europe. A game with his European partners, a game with the British electorate, and a game with his party. Where does the speech leave him with each?
Okay, let's look at the first level first. David Cameron's European partners. This really is the decisive game, as everything else depends on its outcome. I would argue that in many ways the speech was very clever. It was framed as a future of Europe speech, and as such it stands in line with forerunners as different as Thatcher, Fisher, Verhofstadt and Blair. There was also a lot to like about the speech in Brussels. The nod to Europe's historical achievements, the almost Europhile finale, the challenges and principles identified. Because really, who can argue against accountability, against competitiveness, against flexibility, against tackling global challenges jointly? Except perhaps by saying that to tackle challenges jointly, you need efficient decision-making and you need effective implementation, and thus, perhaps, more qualified majority voting and strong supranational institutions. And except perhaps by arguing that Europe has always been an exercise in market shaping, as well as in market making, and that a level playing field requires the uniform application of those rules that all partners have agreed to. I think there are also some question marks about David Cameron's likely negotiation success, and I would identify four. First, this is a speech about national interest, which made me think, in turn, what is the national interest of countries such as Germany and Greece, France and Poland, Sweden and Luxembourg, in granting Britain an even more flexible relationship with Europe, in giving Britain perhaps an opt-out from social policy, which is a key area in the level playing field that is the single market. Second, this is a speech asking for treaty reform. Britain's European partners may well decide to try to put the economic governance structure into the treaty, something Britain prevented them from doing earlier. But after the very bumpy road they travelled from Larkin to Lisbon, I really wonder whether there's appetite between the then 27 member states to reopen Europe's very complex constitutional compromise to accommodate the UK. Third, this is a speech that signals dependence on a deal. David Cameron does not have a political alternative to negotiated agreement. His partners do, the status quo. And that really puts the UK in a different situation from the one Denmark was in the early 1990s. Back then, everyone depended on Denmark to ratify the Maastricht Treaty for the treaty to enter into force, which in turn made everyone willing to grant Denmark quite far-reaching opt-outs. And finally, this is a speech demanding concessions, backed by a thinly veiled threat. David Cameron, however, does not say which concessions he plans to make in turn. And in a negotiation system which is very strongly based on compromise, on give and take, and on mutual accommodation, this does not put him in a strong negotiation position.
If the Prime Minister's bargaining position is challenging vis-à-vis his European partners, what about his position vis-à-vis the British electorate?
So I would argue that that game is even less predictable. So the question of a second Conservative victory aside, its parameters are entirely unclear. Assuming that David Cameron will be able to strike a deal in Brussels, will he also be able to sell it as a triumph at home? Repatriating a few powers from Brussels will probably not do, nor would an amended treaty, unless it really offered sweeping reform. And as we all know, this is notoriously difficult to achieve in Brussels. David Cameron will need something fundamental to show to his public, and he needs 27 member states to say yes. The British public, according to David Cameron, will also need to say yes in the in-out referendum. It has just been promised. Midterm into the next Conservative government, this also means that voters will have to choose to actually cast their vote on Britain's relationship with Europe, rather than passing a verdict on the government of the day. Finally, assuming that David Cameron does not get the deal he wants in Brussels, and assuming that he will still need to hold the referendum, what will he campaign for? Yes or no, in or out? Politically, neither seems viable.
If this is indeed the case, then what about the third level, the Conservative Party?
I would argue that the speech was vague enough to square the circle. David Cameron, on the one hand, defended the island nation, and on the other hand, argued or promised to campaign heart and soul for the hypothetical deal. But squaring the circle rhetorically may not necessarily buy him political peace for three reasons. First, UKIP may still do very well in the next elections to the European Parliament, which take place next year. Rather than thinking about a referendum in 2017, disenchanted voters may simply choose to cast a protest vote in 2014. Also, the Europe skeptics in his party may not choose to campaign for an in. And the speech has certainly not done what it was set out to do, namely stopping the Conservatives quarrelling over Europe. Finally, and that brings me back to a previous point, the Prime Minister has really not answered the hardest question, which may also be the question of keenest interest to his party. What will David Cameron do if he fails to reach agreement in Brussels? What will he campaign for if he only reaches a moderate deal? What if he does not manage to shape the European Union according to his wishes by 2017? Which brings me back to the first level and to the question of whether David Cameron has tested the ground in Paris, in Brussels, in Berlin before going in front of the cameras in London. If not, his game may be difficult to win.